You do not return to your addiction because it feels good. You return because it works. That is the thing no one wants to say out loud, and it is the thing that changes everything once you finally hear it. Most people believe addiction is about pleasure, that the person drinking too much or disappearing into screens late at night or reaching for something they swore they would not reach for again is simply chasing a feeling they enjoy. And because they enjoy it, they keep going back. The solution on this view is obvious. Develop stronger willpower, make a firm decision, suffer through the discomfort and come out the other side free. That is a reasonable belief. It is also wrong. Not wrong in a minor way, wrong in a way that explains why so many people fail year after year despite genuine effort, despite real motivation, despite fully knowing, that the behavior is hurting them. If addiction was simply about pleasure, pain would cure it. If something you love begins to destroy your health, your relationships, your sense of yourself, you would stop. Pain is a powerful instructor, and yet people do not stop. They continue. Sometimes they continue while actively feeling disgusted with themselves. Sometimes they do the behavior and feel nothing pleasurable at all. They are going through the motions of a habit that no longer even delivers what it once promised. And yet, they return. That is the puzzle. That is the place where the common explanation breaks down completely. So let me offer you a different way of seeing this. Your addiction is not your enemy. It is your solution. A misguided one, a destructive one, a temporary one, but a solution nonetheless. And it is solving something specific, something you may not have named, something your conscious mind has perhaps refused to look at directly. Once you understand that, the addiction does not disappear, but it loses a certain kind of power, because you are no longer fighting something mysterious. You are looking at a mechanism, and mechanisms can be understood. Let us begin at the beginning. Consider what actually happens in the mind before the addictive behavior occurs. Not during, not after, before. There is almost always something there, a tension, a discomfort, something the person wants to move away from. It might be the particular exhaustion that comes from a day in which you felt overlooked, or incompetent, or invisible. It might be the low, formless anxiety that settles in during quiet moments when there is nothing to distract the mind. It might be loneliness, not dramatic loneliness, but the ordinary kind that comes from sitting in a room with people who do not quite understand you. It might be shame, old shame carried for years, the kind that is not attached to any single memory but lives somewhere underneath everything. The behavior follows that discomfort, and here is the key word: it relieves it. Not permanently, not even adequately, but for a moment the pressure drops, the noise quiets, the feeling recedes. And that moment of relief, that reduction in psychic pain, is more reinforcing than pleasure ever could be. This is what behavioral science has come to understand, and what I observed long ago in my clinical work. Relief is more addictive than pleasure. The removal of pain is more compelling than the addition of joy. And this means that addiction is not fundamentally about seeking something. It is about escaping something. Think about the person who pours a drink at the end of the workday. Ask them why, and they will likely say something about unwinding, about enjoying the taste, about relaxing after a long day. All of this may be true in some superficial sense, but look more carefully. The drink arrives at precisely the moment when the day's work is finished, and the mind would otherwise have to sit with itself. The drink arrives when the quiet comes, when there is no more external noise to occupy the attention, when the accumulated frustrations, the small defeats, the unfinished emotional business of the day would otherwise surface. The drink does not just taste good, it interrupts that process. It creates a chemical barrier between the person and whatever would have arrived in that silence. That is the function. That is what it is doing. Now, take away the drink and what happens? The person must sit in that silence. The feelings that had no outlet during the day now have nowhere to go. The anxiety rises, the discomfort intensifies, and the person reaches for the drink not because they are weak, but because the drink has become the mechanism by which they manage an internal state they have never learned to manage any other way. This is what I mean when I say every addiction has a job. Some addictions manage anxiety, others manage loneliness. Some soothe an injury to the sense of self, the person who uses pornography after a moment of rejection because the fantasy restores the feeling of being desired. Some addictions fill a void created by boredom so complete it begins to feel like meaninglessness. Some manage grief. Some manage rage that cannot be expressed any other way without consequence. In every case, there is a specific internal pressure the behavior is responding to, and this is why willpower fails. When a person tries to stop through determination alone, they are removing the behavior. They are taking away the bucket that was catching the water. But the pipe is still leaking. The internal pressure still exists. The emotional need has not changed. The discomfort has not been addressed. And so the pressure builds and builds until eventually, sometimes days later, sometimes weeks later, sometimes months later, it finds the old path. Because the old path is still there. Because the mind learned it. Because it worked. The relapse is not a failure of character. It is the predictable result of removing a solution without replacing what the solution was doing. But here is where it becomes stranger still. Ask yourself this: why does the person not simply recognize the function the addiction is serving? If drinking is managing anxiety, why not simply say, "I have anxiety, and I am using alcohol to manage it"? Why is this so rarely how it appears from the inside? The answer lies in something the mind does that I spent many years observing. The mind does not like to know things that are painful or inconvenient. Not because it is dishonest exactly, but because knowing certain things requires doing something about them, and doing something about them is threatening. So the mind develops ways of knowing without knowing, of seeing without seeing. A man drinks every evening. He does not think of himself as someone managing depression. He thinks of himself as someone who enjoys a drink. The framing matters enormously. One framing is benign, social, pleasant. The other is a problem that demands attention, self-examination, possibly professional help. The mind will choose the first framing almost every time because the second one opens a door the person is not ready to walk through. This is not weakness. This is one of the most powerful operations the human mind performs. It protects the person from their own interior. At a significant cost, yes, but it does protect them. And so the behavior continues. Not because the person is unintelligent, not because they do not understand that what they are doing is harmful. They often understand this completely. They can describe the harm in detail. But understanding the harm and understanding the function are entirely different things. A person can know that the behavior is destroying them and still not understand what the behavior is doing for them. And without understanding what it does, they cannot imagine what they would do instead. This is the trap. Let me show you another layer. Consider what happens when a behavior has been repeated many thousands of times. In the beginning, there was some degree of conscious choice. The first time someone drank to calm their nerves, or scrolled compulsively to escape loneliness, or overate to fill an emotional hollow, there was a decision, even if that decision was barely conscious. Something uncomfortable arose. The behavior followed. Relief came. And a connection was made in the mind between the discomfort and the behavior. A lesson was learned. With each repetition, that connection becomes more deeply encoded. The mind is extraordinarily efficient at learning. It learns that when this particular sensation arises, this specific quality of tension or anxiety or loneliness, this behavior follows. And after enough repetitions, the connection becomes automatic. It no longer requires conscious deliberation. It operates below the level of choice. This is the point at which people often describe feeling as though they are watching themselves from a distance. They say things like, "I do not even know why I reach for it. I am already halfway through it before I realize what I am doing." It is as if something else takes over. That is not a figure of speech. That is an accurate description of what is happening neurologically. The behavior has been transferred from the realm of conscious decision into something closer to reflex. The cue arrives, a stressful interaction at work, a moment of silence, a particular time of evening, a familiar emotional sensation, and the behavior begins before the conscious mind has registered what is happening. You are no longer choosing. You are running a program that was installed through repetition. And this is why the person who says, "I will stop after this one," becomes not so much a liar as someone who genuinely does not understand the nature of what they are contending with. They are speaking from the conscious, reasoning mind. But the behavior is not being generated by the conscious, reasoning mind. It is being generated by something older, faster, and entirely indifferent to the decision that was just made. Now, here is the part that people find most disturbing when they genuinely sit with it. The addiction does not just solve a problem. Over time, it becomes part of the identity. Think about what happens when a behavior is repeated consistently, across years, often across decades. The mind eventually stops experiencing it as something the person does and begins experiencing it as something the person is. The behavior becomes incorporated into the sense of self, and the self protects itself. This is one of the most overlooked mechanisms in all of human behavior. When you threaten to take away something that has become part of a person's identity, they resist, not because they do not want to change, necessarily, but because what you are threatening is not just a habit. You are threatening the structure of how they understand themselves, their routines, their rituals, the things around which their days are organized, the private way they have of managing the difficulty of being alive. A person who has smoked for 20 years is not just someone who smokes cigarettes. The cigarettes are woven into the texture of the day, after meals, during breaks, in moments of stress. The cigarettes are how transitions happen, how certain feelings are managed. Remove them, and it is not just a habit that disappears. A whole scaffolding collapses, and the person must rebuild without knowing how. This is why people say they feel lost in early recovery, not because they miss the pleasure of the substance, but because the substance was organizing their days, and now there is nothing there. The identity problem is deeper still, because once the addiction has become part of who someone is, they begin, unconsciously but quite powerfully, to defend it. They rationalize it. They minimize it. They find evidence that it is not so serious. They find other people who do the same thing and feel reassured. They tell themselves they could stop if they wanted to, which preserves the sense of agency without requiring them to actually test it. Consider the man who insists he drinks no more than anyone he knows. He is probably not lying. He has arranged his social world around people who drink comparably. He has unconsciously sought out confirmation that his level of use is normal, not because he set out to deceive himself, but because the self protects itself from information that would require uncomfortable action. This is what I observed repeatedly in clinical work. It is not the behavior that is most difficult to confront. It is the admission that the behavior has a function, because admitting the function means admitting the underlying need. And admitting the underlying need means confronting the thing you have spent years not confronting. And this brings me to what I consider the deepest layer of all. Why is the underlying need so difficult to face? In my experience, it is almost always because the underlying need carries shame. Not always the obvious kind of shame. Sometimes it is something quieter. The shame of needing comfort, the shame of being lonely, the shame of feeling inadequate or afraid or overwhelmed. These are things that people do not like to admit, especially to themselves, because to admit them requires a certain vulnerability that feels dangerous. It feels dangerous because very often there is an old history that made such vulnerability actually dangerous. The person who grew up in an environment where emotional needs were ignored or punished or met with inconsistency learns something essential. My needs are not safe to express. They learn to manage those needs privately, to suppress them, to find other ways of addressing them that do not require visibility or dependence on another person or the risk of rejection. The addiction becomes the private, reliable, non-human solution to the problem of having needs in a world that did not honor them. You cannot be rejected by a bottle. You cannot be disappointed by a screen. You cannot be misunderstood by food. These things do not require you to be vulnerable. They do not require you to ask. They deliver relief without the risk that comes with needing relief from another person. And so the addiction is not simply managing discomfort. At a deeper level, it is managing the specific fear of depending on something that might fail you. It is the chosen solution of someone who learned at some point that asking did not work, that need was not safe, that the only reliable comfort was the one that required nothing from anyone else. This is what I mean when I say the symptom is chosen, not consciously, not deliberately, but it is not random. It is specifically shaped by the exact contour of the person's emotional history, their particular unmet needs, the specific fears they carry, which is why two people can develop entirely different addictions in response to similar underlying states. Anxiety in one person produces compulsive eating. In another, it produces obsessive work. In a third, it produces excessive drinking. The underlying pressure may be similar. The chosen solution is personal. Now let me address something that many people believe and that causes a great deal of unnecessary suffering. The belief that understanding alone is sufficient. You may have followed everything I have said. You may recognize the mechanism clearly. You may see, perhaps for the first time, what your particular addiction is doing for you, what it has been managing, what it has been protecting you from. And you may find, to your frustration, that the behavior continues. This does not mean the understanding was wrong. It means understanding is only the beginning. The habit is encoded. The emotional need is still present. The underlying fear has not been resolved. Understanding the map does not change the terrain. But understanding the map is where the real work must begin. Because until you understand what you are actually dealing with, every effort to change is an effort aimed at the wrong target. The person who is trying to quit drinking through sheer decision is fighting the symptom. They are trying to stop the behavior without addressing the anxiety, the loneliness, the shame, the unmet need that the behavior has been managing. And as long as those things remain, as long as the pipe is still leaking, the pressure will return, and the behavior will return with it. What actually weakens an addiction is not force. It is not greater discipline or more severe punishment or more emphatic resolution. What weakens an addiction is removing its purpose. This happens in two ways. The first is learning to tolerate what the addiction has been helping you avoid, the emotions, the feelings, the internal states that the behavior was covering. This is not easy work. It is often uncomfortable in a way that surprises people, not because the feelings are more dramatic than they expected, but because they are more ordinary. The anxiety is not catastrophic. The loneliness is survivable. The shame, when looked at directly, is less overwhelming than it seemed when it was something to be escaped. But knowing this intellectually and experiencing it in practice are different things. It requires repetition. It requires sitting with discomfort until the mind learns that discomfort can be endured without the behavior. The second way is replacing the function. If the addiction was managing anxiety, and anxiety is still present, then something else must manage the anxiety. Not perfectly, not as efficiently as the addiction did, but something. Because the need does not disappear simply because the behavior does. The need is real. It requires a response. The person who removes the addiction without addressing the need is standing in a house with a leaking pipe, having thrown away the bucket and wondering why they are still getting wet. Here is perhaps the most important thing I want to leave you with. The reason addiction is so persistent, so resistant to ordinary willpower, so capable of surviving relapse after relapse, is not because you are weak. It is because you built something that worked. Imperfectly, destructively, at enormous cost to your health and your relationships and your future. But it worked. It was solving a problem. And the mind does not abandon solutions without replacement. You are not failing to control yourself. You are succeeding at something else entirely. You have been successfully managing a pressure, an emotion, a fear, a need that you may not have had any other way of managing. The behavior is the evidence not of your worst qualities, but of your mind's relentless insistence on finding some kind of equilibrium. The question that matters is not, why am I so weak? The question that matters is, what has this been doing for me? And then, what would I need instead? That is not a comfortable question. It often opens into territory that has not been examined in years, or decades, or perhaps ever. It reveals things about the self that the self would have preferred not to know. But it is the question that actually leads somewhere. Because once you see the function, you can begin to think about replacing it. And once you begin to replace it, slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks, the addiction begins to lose what it has always depended on. Not your pleasure, not your weakness, your need. And needs, when they are met honestly, do not require destructive substitutes. That is the insight this title promises. And it is not a simple one, but it is a real one. And real insights, unlike simple ones, have the capacity to actually change something. You do not need to fight harder. You need to understand more clearly. Start there.